hopefully this, yep. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes.
Is it working? Okay, great. Hopefully my laptop survives because I've got a million tabs open in Firefox. My name's Neal Reeves. I can't remember my job title, but I'm a postdoc at King's College in London. And I mostly work in Work Package 5 with various other action partners. And we look at things like design, engagement. And this particular presentation is going to be about motivations. But actually, I'm going to start by not talking about motivation at all. I'm going to start talking very briefly about what engagement looks like in a typical citizen science project. There's something that some of you might be familiar with in some variant or another, known as the Pareto principle or the 80-20 or 90-10 rule. In any series of elements to be controlled by some small fraction, it has a number of elements, is always accounted for a large fraction in terms of effect. So this is like from 1954. It's been around for a long time. You get it in sociology, in ecology, in finance, economics, but you also get it on the internet. So you may be familiar with the long tail effect. I stole this picture from Wikipedia. And effectively, in most online communities, and citizen science is certainly no exception, and this happens in kind of face-to-face projects as well, a small minority of the participants contribute a very large proportion of the work, and a large proportion of the participants contribute very little. And what we really need to bear in mind is that the most successful projects have to appeal not only to this proportion of participants doing, all the work, but also the large number of participants who only do a few things. So if each participant only does one task, that doesn't sound like a lot, but by the time you have maybe tens of thousands of participants, that's tens of thousands of classifications that you wouldn't otherwise get. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, the first thing is that obviously the majority of workers contribute very little, but this has knock-on effects for how we understand motivation. So a lot of the studies of motivation would disproportionately represent longer term or dedicated participants, because when you run, say, a survey, the participants who come in, do 5 tasks and leave aren't going to be captured necessarily. And another thing that we should really note, and this kind of underpins everything I'm about to say, is that the participants' reported motivations don't always match up to their behavior. And I'll give some specific examples as we go along. When I'm talking about motivations, what I really kind of mean are the factors that drive engagement in citizen science projects. So we can kind of classify those motivations into 2 categories, and there's also altruism, which is an intrinsic motivation, but I'll talk about that separately because it's kind of special. Intrinsic motivations are internal factors. So they're things like interests, goals, finding something fun, wanting to improve yourself, wanting to learn. So if we take this image on the right, if the person is running on the clock just because they enjoy running on clocks, then that's an intrinsic motivation. We also have extrinsic motivations, which are the carrot and stick kind of model. They're external factors. When someone's rewarded, there's competition, they want to perform well against others, things like gamification, but also sometimes coercion, or maybe like in a classroom setting, the pupils might be encouraged to visit a project and participate by their teacher. Those are extrinsic factors. And we also have altruism, which basically doing things for the common good, doing things for charity, doing things for the benefit of others, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So this sounds really obvious, but the thing to really bear in mind is that different workers are motivated by different things. So what motivates one worker will not necessarily motivate another. Even when we look at that kind of power law distribution, where we have lots of workers doing very little, they're not all motivated by the same thing. And when we have few workers doing a lot of tasks, they're also not motivated by the same thing. You can't necessarily kind of split them into easy categories. So it can be tempting to try and go full Pokemon and catch them all. And to an extent, that's not a bad idea. But the different motivations kind of have different effects on worker behaviors and on individual workers. And so there are these trade-offs and kind of unanticipated effects in terms of engagement. So the kind of main rule for that is that at the risk of angering every psychologist and sociologist in the world, if we break this down into a very simple principle, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations don't tend to play well together. So someone who does something because they're interested in science or interested in anything, when you come along and pay them, suddenly that interest tends to dwindle a bit. There's a bit more to it, obviously. I'm simplifying this greatly, but it's key to think about the fact that when we have an intrinsic motivation and an extrinsic motivation, and we put them together, the sum is not always that of the two parts. So intrinsic motivations tend to be the most common ones in the literature around citizen science and the ones that are most commonly designed for. So I'll go through those first. These are, in the words of kind of Desi and Ryan, who kind of came up with this whole kind of framework, intrinsic motivations are propelled by people's interest in the activity itself. They work best for tasks that are inherently enjoyable or fun or interesting, or there's something about the task that makes me want to do it. They can be, especially in a citizen science context, a bit harder to get your volunteers in the first place. That's again a generalization, but it's slightly easier to be like, oh, I'll give you a badge for taking part than it is to say, oh, I'll teach you something. But they tend to be associated with longer periods of engagement. But again, going back to this long tail, that doesn't mean that everyone that has an intrinsic motivation will stick around for a long time. And the most common one in the literature is interest in science, or interest in like a discipline, or what a project wants to do, or a particular kind of topic like stars, for example. And it doesn't even need to be a particularly strong interest. It can be just a curiosity, or like, oh, I think that looks cool. These are particularly strong, apparently, according to a paper I read in web-based data analysis projects. I guess because it's easier to contribute. That seems to be how I interpreted this kind of idea. And they have this benefit of intensifying over time in longer term participants, where there's this feedback loop of, I'm curious, I learn about the project, suddenly I'm more interested, I do more work, I learn more, and so on. They tend to be associated with higher quantities of contributions than some of the other motivations, but there's a very, very mild negative association. It's like P equals, it's just like 0.05. There's like, so it's around a 5% probability that it may not be the case. A very mild negative association with accuracy. So people with an intrinsic motivation don't necessarily perform tasks as well as those who have extrinsic motivations. But again, that's a very sweeping generalization. Self-improvement and learning is kind of associated with that. And there are participants who show a keenness to learn about projects even from a very early stage, like when they first join. It can result in long-term engagement, but just participating in a project doesn't mean it's educational. This is a common finding, that just completing a project, no matter how scientific it might be, doesn't teach me about science itself. There are also collective and community motivations. I have citations for all of these, by the way. I took them out because it was hard to read, but if anyone wants any more information, just let me know and I can share this with you. Collective and community motives are highly motivating in the literature to a certain extent, but they're also a source of a large amount of disagreement. So some participants seem to enjoy being part of a community and working together and interacting, and that extends to communicating with or being part of a community with scientists. But it doesn't seem to be very effective at recruiting participants. And this is one of the motives that seems to be most affected by the fact that we're looking at the longer term participants when we're doing surveys and things. So it may be more of a secondary motivation. There's some evidence of that. But it's also worth pointing out that often a citizen science project isn't necessarily a community. A lot of the most simple projects, for example, there's no way of communicating, no way of interacting. So that's something that would have to be kind of added in. Linked to that is discussion and interaction and kind of social factors, which also aren't inherent in citizen science projects. They either are added in or they're on social networks. They don't tend to be very strong, but they are associated with long-term participation. So the participants who tend to contribute to this contribute in the long term, and that could mean that people are motivated in the long term by social factors, or it could mean that people who are motivated by social factors stick around. We just don't really know. but it does have the added benefit of supported learning. It supports interests associated with learning, and there's some evidence that people who participate in the social factors tend to contribute more. And just briefly, because we're particularly looking at web-based projects in this second accelerator, there is an interaction with technology. It's relatively simplistic. Basically, if your project is easy to use and seems like up to date, that tends to be associated with more participation and better recruitment than if your project is constantly blue screening or down all the time. Which brings us to extrinsic motivations, and these are a bit more complicated. At first, they seem quite simple. So an extrinsic motivation is some kind of external factor: money, rewards, points, badges, games, coercion, that will make a task that's perhaps less interesting, either more interesting, or they add a reason to do it, and they drive engagement in that way. Extrinsic motivations are particularly risky in kind of a citizen science context because they don't necessarily appeal to all participants. There's quite a complex interplay of intrinsic motivations. So when I said earlier that they don't play well together, that's not strictly true. Sometimes being rewarded for doing something that I enjoy can increase that enjoyment, but on the whole, they tend to reduce motivations, or they're associated with quite short-term boosts or short-term engagement. So the most common kind of extrinsic factor is rewards. Physical rewards like actual prizes are quite rare in citizen science, but they can also cover online things, points, badges, achievements, certificates, things like that. But there's a general assumption in the literature and some evidence that they're associated with quite weak motivation. They don't really drive long-term participation very well. And it's worth pointing out, because I saw a couple of projects that I reviewed that suggested this. Money is generally quite bad. Projects that have experimented with money have had kind of problems. But physical rewards like mugs, t-shirts and things can sometimes be associated with increased kind of feel of community and a kind of intrinsic motivation that way. There's gamification. It can be quite complex to do right. It basically, its simplest is in the inclusion of a game element or game elements, plural, in otherwise serious tasks. This picture on the right is a game called Eterna, which is actually like a kind of like a proper puzzle game. It's for solving RNA folding, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. It starts easy and gets quite hard, so you have to match the colors which match up to like the RNA molecules, so cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil, I think, if my A-level biology is still correct. And this is obviously quite clearly a puzzle, like you can see it as a game, but there are others that are quite simple. They just add points, leaderboards, or badges to an otherwise standard task. Gamification has some quite mixed results. It can be motivating and it can enhance motivations in some volunteers, and it's generally associated with quite long participation periods, but it can seem to trivialize important research. So volunteers who are driven very much by the kind of serious science can find them off-putting, and sometimes there's this delicate balancing act that you need to do. Competitions are another thing that they're quite simple, and they do occur, especially in pollution. So we have things like kind of similar to like a BioBlitz, the idea of getting as many pictures or whatever in a certain period of time, but they can be done through leaderboards and rankings. They can be an effective way of driving participation, particularly in the short term. So if I see that someone has done, I don't know, 10 classifications, I've done 8, I might try and boost my participation. But if particularly when that participation is seen as unachievable, which happens often in the long term, you know, if one person has done 3,000 classifications, suddenly it can kind of be off-putting. Why would I even start if I can never kind of reach that goal? And they don't appeal to all volunteers, so they can be described as stressful, or kind of like not in keeping with the kind of collaborative spirit of science. And some projects have kind of had success of doing competitions very briefly in the short term, like periodic events, like I mentioned here, and not making the competition like a main focus of the project. And then the main thing that I think is important to talk about for citizen science is altruism. So like doing things for the common good, for charity, for science, for the benefit of all. It can be really tempting to rely on altruism because, I mean, ultimately, isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to get people to volunteer to help with science. And people are motivated by it. It would be wrong to say they're not. It can be very motivating, particularly in the long term. But altruism is quite poor at driving initial participation, in the sense that while it can be engaging, a lot of volunteers do not respond to kind of altruistic messages. So there was a study conducted by Lee and some others in 2018, published in the Journal of Science Communications, that looked at different recruitment messages for driving participation in citizen science. And the messages that performed the worst were the altruistic messages. But they were associated with kind of longer and more intense participation. The problem with altruism is it tends to develop in the medium to long term. So I might join a project because I'm interested, or perhaps because it gives me points or whatever. And then I kind of get this idea that what I'm doing has value. And then over time, I might move towards a more altruistic kind of motive and way of contributing. Altruistic individuals tend to make the highest number of contributions because they stick around for the longest period of time. But if you are going to make use of altruistic motivations as kind of a key point of your project, it's really important to kind of give feedback to the volunteers, to make them feel valued, to make them feel that like what they're doing is making a difference. Because altruistic volunteers can be some of the most kind of fickle and easily disheartened volunteers, in the sense that if they think that they're making a difference and then they see that science, research moves slow, right? So it can take a long time to publish, say, a paper. And if the volunteers don't think that their work is leading to anything, then they might think that it doesn't have any kind of value. And so I've just got some key takeaways. I don't know how I'm doing for time, hopefully not too badly. So intrinsic, extrinsic, and as kind of a category of intrinsic motivations, altruistic motives can all drive participation in citizen science. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivations are kind of the most effective to get your volunteers through the door and into your project in the first place. Intrinsic motivations tend to be negatively impacted by extrinsic motivations, although we could have a whole presentation on that in itself. Intrinsic and altruistic motivations are the ones that drive the longer term participation, particularly altruism, but also interest and the feeling of being a community and kind of not wanting to leave. Altruism in particular develops in the long term, so it's less effective upfront, but it can be very effective at driving longer term participation. And engagement and participation is very asymmetrical. Different participants will contribute for different periods of time and different levels of intensity. And the motivations and behaviors are very much unique to volunteers. So where possible, it's best to kind of try and appeal to a wide array of different motivations without with accounting for and without ignoring the trade-offs and negative impacts that can occur. And I think that's everything. So I don't know if there are any questions or